Hello and welcome to this second video where I'm going to be talking some more about risk. In the first video, which I will put a link to in the description below, I talked particularly about the idea of using the decisional balance and the biopsychosocial model for assessing risk. In this video, I'm going to be looking more at the question of how you manage that risk once you have assessed it. So let's just quickly recap on the idea of how we conceptualize risk using the decisional balance. We can think about risks using two particular dimensions. The first is how big a risk or a protective factor is. So if we are absolutely sure that something bad has happened and is likely to happen in the future, that is a big risk. If we know that somebody can do things to manage that situation, to prevent harm happening from it, to put things right, that's a big protective factor. If it's something that we're not really so sure about, or we think is only a relatively minor harm, minor risk, or if we think there's a protective factor but it's not that great a protective factor, it's better than nothing but it's not fantastic, that's quite small. And that's the first element we can put into the decisional balance. The second part is how likely we think these risks are. So if we think something is really likely, or if we're very sure of something, or very definite something, that's like pushing it out towards the end of the balance, where the leverage effect will mean it has a bigger effect on our decision making. If we think it is very unlikely, then in that case, it's more towards the center of the decisional balance, and it will weigh slightly less in our decision making. So as you can see from this, when we have relatively big harm factors and relatively small or unlikely to be used protective factors, we can see that tips the balance to make things unsafe. On the other hand, where the protective factors clearly outweigh the harm factors, in that situation, we're happy to say this is a situation where things are safe. This means that when it comes to managing risk, we need to ask three key questions. The first is what, specifically, are the harm factors and the protective factors? What are we worried about? What are the things that mean we're not as worried as we might be? Secondly, we need to ask, well, how harmful or protective are these factors? And then finally, we need to ask, how likely are they to happen? When we're doing this, we really need to be specific. We need to be quite concrete in exactly what we are worried about and also exactly what we see as the person's strengths or the strengths within the situation the person is in. And to do this, we really need to give evidence. We need to give clear, concrete evidence of what our risks are. So let's just stop and ponder for a moment. Think about how you would use these three questions in practice. How would you decide what the risk factors are and the protective factors? How would you decide how harmful they are? And how would you work out how likely they are to happen? So let's move on to the idea of thinking about how we manage harm reduction. Now we're going to do this by looking at harm reduction and then at boosting coping strategies and protective factors. So when we look at harm reduction, the first thing we can do is we can make a situation less harmful. And this is a very common way. We can say, okay, that you know something is going to happen, you know that somebody's likely to have a problem. Well, how can we make sure that when that problem does arise, it's not going to cause major harm or damage? And using this balance idea, that's like shrinking the size of the bit on the balance. The second thing we can ask is how can we make it less likely to happen? Sometimes we can work and we can actually say, look, this might happen, but how can we make sure it's less likely to happen? And that's another way we manage risk. And this is a bit like moving things from the edge of the balance, where the leverage effect is going to be stronger, towards the middle. Think about this like on a seesaw. You know that if you sit right on the end of a seesaw, you have more pressure pushing down. If you sit towards the middle of the seesaw, not so much pressure. And the same can be done with those risk factors. In any situation, there's bound to be some risks. And what you notice is often what will do one of these will also do the other. What will often make the risk less harmful will also make it less likely to happen. Not always, but that's quite common. So just think for a moment. Think of a few practice situations that a social worker might encounter. How might the social worker or how might the service user and the social worker make those things less harmful? how might they make them less likely to happen? And as you're doing that, consider specifically who must do what in order to achieve those goals. So let's move over to the other side. Let's move over to the side of boosting coping. So here we need to think about what can we do to make coping strategies more effective, those protective factors more effective. And just as we saw before, that is a bit like boosting the size of the box on the scales, tipping the scales in our favour. The second thing we can do is we can make these coping things easier to do, or more, that makes them more likely to happen. So if it's easier for the person to do them, they're more likely to do it, and that pushes out that box out from the middle of the scale to the edge of the scale where it's more likely to manage the risk. And the third thing we can do when we're managing risk is we can create new protective factors. We can introduce new things that the person wasn't previously doing that will help it. And that is just like adding an extra box to the scale to make it more likely to happen. And just like with the risk factors, these are interlinked. They're not separate. You can do all three together. So just think back to a moment to the risks that I asked you to identify earlier in the video. Think about what, in that situation where you've got a risk, what protective factors might exist. How might the social worker make them more effective? And how might they make them easier for the service user to do? Then also think about what else could the social worker, the service user or others do to manage that situation better. So really consider carefully who must do what in order to achieve those goals. Just to give some concluding thoughts to this, when you're managing risk, it's really important that you put the person with the least power at the heart of your intervention. In all of these, whether it's your harm factors or whether it's your protective factors, you need to be specific and concrete. Nothing vague here. It needs to be in language that everybody can understand and everybody is clear about. You need to focus both on risks and strengths. Don't become so risk-focused that you can't see the strengths, but also don't become so strength-focused that you can't acknowledge the risks. Always bear in mind that safety is possible, but never inevitable. That's important to bear that in mind. That stops you falling into the problem of confirmation bias. And just remember that things constantly change. So you can assess risk at one point, you can begin an intervention, but then actually you need to be constantly adjusting your assessment of risks and of strengths as you go through the work. And then finally, I'm going to leave a point here, which is that people don't succeed or fail, systems succeed or fail. Bear that in mind, that you're not just doing this on your own, you're part of a system. So as you're managing risk, remember to think systemically and draw on the wider system around the individual. Thank you for watching. I really hope that's been useful for you.